Hi guys, this is Philosophy of Psychology Lecture 10 on split brain syndrome and the unity of consciousness. I'm working from the slides from now. Um, so this is a very cool topic. I hope you like it and think about the connections that we've seen with other topics. So the first slide gives you an overview of the lecture. So I'll talk first a bit about the unity of consciousness, then describe the split brain syndrome in the main experiment that gives evidence of it. And the thought is that the split brain syndrome possibly threatens the unity of consciousness. So then we need to think about what's going on in split brain cases, and we'll look at a few different interpretations, actually 5, and try to decide, well, you've got to decide which of them you prefer, and then we'll think at the end about whether their relationship to the unity of consciousness, depending on which interpretation we take, the unity of consciousness may be threatened or not. And we'll think about, I guess the overall question is, does the split brain syndrome disprove the unity of consciousness, or show that it can be broken? So let's start with the unity of consciousness. Here's Brie Gertler, and she gives a little everyday example of this. So suppose that your current total phenomenal state, so total phenomenal state, she means everything that you're experiencing right now, all your thoughts, conscious thoughts, feelings, everything, awareness of your body, all your visual experiences, the whole lot, everything that's within your conscious awareness right now. So suppose that your current total phenomenal state is exhausted by the feeling of your feet in your socks and the smell of onion. So exhausted by, she means all it contains is the feeling of your feet and your socks and the smell of onion. She doesn't mean anything about you being tired. This is philosopher's way of saying this is all there is to it. So all there is to your current total experience right now, this is an artificially limited example, all there is to all you're experiencing right now is the feeling of your feet in your socks and the smell of onion. So imagine that. Then, she says, your total phenomenal state embeds the feet in socks feeling, and it also embeds the onion smell. So you've got these two feelings. One's a smell, one's a feeling, a proprioceptive feeling about the body, and they're both embedded in this total experiential or phenomenal state of yours. So she says, you would not possess your total phenomenal state, call it B, if you did not have that feet and socks feeling. Nor would you possess B without the onion smell token. So if you're having a certain experience, which includes both, if you took one away or the other away, then it wouldn't be that experience anymore. You'd be having a different total phenomenal state. So each experience, so when you're having an overall global experience, each mini experience that's part of it is kind of essential to it. If you took any of them away, then your overall experience would be different. But it doesn't work the other way around, doesn't apply. You could have either of these sensations without having B. So you could just smell the onion smell by itself, or smell it with something else, not the feet and socks feeling, and vice versa. You could have the feet and socks feeling without the onion smell. So you can have each of the little component feelings of your total phenomenal state without having the global state. They could come before it or hang around after it, but that particular thing you're experiencing all at the time includes all of those mini experiences, if you like, those component experiences. Okay, so this should be pretty close to common sense. We experience many phenomenal elements, you could call them, different feelings at a time. Think about what you're seeing versus smelling. If you're tasting something right now, the feeling of your body, heat, pressure sensations. You could include your conscious thoughts. That's a topic we're coming to in weeks 11 and 12. In the whole bundle of different kinds of feelings that comprise your very complex total phenomenal state at a time. Now, the point about those experiences, those mini or component experiences, is they're phenomenally unified, which is to say we experience them all together. This is something that's so obvious about it. It's so obvious about experience, as in it's an ever-present thing, that you don't really remark on it or notice it, but it's actually quite a significant feature of experience, that you don't just experience what you see and what you hear, you somehow experience them together. So when you see a car coming down the street, you see the red Corvette, let it be, and you hear the sound of the engine growling, and you get those together. You don't just see something and hear something else and somehow have to, in totally different phenomenal places in your experiences, somehow have to hitch them together. Rather, the sound and the sight are given to you together in experience. You experience them unified. There's no other way of putting it. So as Bain puts it, there's actually a conjoint phenomenology. You don't just experience A and experience B. You experience them together, and that togetherness is part of the way you experience them somehow. So he says, Bain goes on, one can think of phenomenal unity as a relation that phenomenal states, i.e. experiences, have when they are experienced together in this way. So to draw further attention to the phenomenon, is you can do it very easily just by thinking about other people. Our feelings are not phenomenally unified with those of other people. So you see and hear the car, and that's phenomenally unified for you. And maybe I see and hear the car as well, and that's phenomenally unified for me. But obviously, my seeing the car is not phenomenally unified with your seeing the car. You don't have access, conscious access, normally, set telepathy aside for now, to what I experience, and vice versa. There are these two self-contained bundles or bubbles of experiences that correspond to your consciousness and my consciousness. Within themselves, they're phenomenally unified. There's this bunch of experiences being had together, unified way by that subject, and another one over here. But the two bundles are not phenomenally unified with each other. I don't experience what you experience, and vice versa. So make more of this a bit later. But you can see phenomenal unity is, or unity of consciousness seems to be the hallmark of one subject, where you've got one subject. You've got one subject because you've got a group of experiences that are experienced in this unified way, and bubbles are separate. So if you want to have a real feeling of philosophical vertigo, think about the unity of consciousness and all these bubbles there are. I mean, sometimes get it when I'm looking at you in the classroom. I look at all of your heads and I think in there is a bubble of consciousness, unified, each one unified and none of them unified with the others. And this whole world in there of what they're thinking right now, and I wonder what's going on, and are they getting the lecture and so on. I think these to myself. But if you stand on an escalator on the tube, on a very long escalator with loads and loads of people on it, and you get to the top and you look down, you see all these faces or a crowd in the platform, and just think in each of these heads is one of these unified bubbles, and none of them are all disunified with respect to each other, and there's this whole world of consciousness in each one. It's mind-boggling. Okay. That's phenomenal unity of consciousness. So the split brain syndrome. How am I doing for time? Not bad. Split brain. So it was an old treatment for epilepsy was to cut the corpus callosum. Actually, I think they still do it. So the epileptic attack starts in one hemisphere, and you cut the corpus callosum, and it can't spread. Corpus callosum is the bundle of fibers on that diagram there. You can see that connects the two hemispheres. So it's like the communication channel. It's like you used to get thick wires that connect your computer monitor to the keyboard. You'd see this thick, it's like that. It's an information transfer. So they would cut this communication channel, and then the epilepsy would stay in one hemisphere and not spread. But this produced some funny side effects. Why? Well, some brain functions happen normally anyway in one hemisphere, notably speech. Speech is in the left hemisphere. There's one of those diagrams you see that I get a bit annoyed about, saying, where all the different traits of personality are located, like creativity is in the right hemisphere, maths is in the left hemisphere. I mean, that's very crude, but normally speaking, there are functions that unless you have an accident and then the brain needs to rewire itself, speech is looked after by the left hemisphere in normal cases. So we can say that, and that's the kind of thing that matters for now. Also, as we know, remember from the beginning of the course, information from each visual field. So by visual field, I mean look straight ahead at a fixed point and then divide your whole visual field in two. You've got two visual hemifields, the left one and the right one. The information from the left visual hemisphere ends up, as we know, in the right visual cortex, and vice versa. The right visual field ends up in the left visual cortex because of the way the wiring works. We looked at that at the beginning. The same is true of the hand, so the tactile information from the right hand ends up in the left hemisphere, and tactile information from the left hand ends up in the right hemisphere. Now, you cut the corpus callosum, the hemispheres cannot now share their information, so the left visual cortex is getting information from the right visual field, but it can't now share it with the right brain hemisphere, and vice versa. The info that the right one has about the left visual field can't be shared with the left hemisphere. So this creates some pretty strange effects, as we'll see. But interestingly, the effects manifest mainly under experimental conditions, and subjects behave pretty normally in everyday life, which is a point that we will come to consider a bit later on. So let's look at the key ring experiment. This is the experiment where split brain syndrome was revealed. So you've got a subject there. Next slide. You've got a subject there looking, fixating on a point dead ahead. So they keep their eyes on that point. And that means that the word key is in the left visual hemisphere. The ring is in the right visual hemisphere. This is a split brainer, so they've had the corpus callosum cut. Now, when asked, so here's Tim Bain, when asked to report what she sees, the patient in the key ring experiment will typically say that she sees only the word ring. Why is that? Think about that for a second. Why will she say she only sees ring? Think about the hemispheres. You see? So the left hemisphere is where speech is looked after. What does the left hemisphere have access to visually? The word ring, because it's the right visual field that feeds into the left hemisphere. So the left hemisphere doesn't see the word key, it sees the word ring. So when you ask the person what they see, it's the left hemisphere that's answering, and it will say ring. But the funny thing is, you see there's these objects, or sometimes it's pictures behind the screen. Then you say, but grab with your left hand the object that corresponds most closely to what you see. With her left hand, the patient may select a picture of a key or a key and ignore pictures of both a ring and a key ring. Why is that? Well, the left hand is controlled by the right hemisphere. What's the right hemisphere seeing? It's seeing the left visual hemifield, and in that is the word ring. Is the word key. So the right hemisphere doesn't see the word ring; it just sees the word key, and when it goes to pick up a key, and it will ignore the key ring and ignore a ring. So it clearly doesn't have any sense of there being the word ring involved. Generally speaking, says Bain, visual information projected to the left visual field cannot be verbally reported. So key can't be verbally reported because it's going to the right hemisphere. And visual information projected to the right visual field is unavailable for behaviour involving the right hand. But obviously, information projected to the left visual field is available for behaviour with the left hand, which is why the person picks up the key. Oh, it's not helpful if I get confused. Picks up the key. Okay, so taken as a whole, there seems to be a visual awareness of the word ring, because the person says ring. There seems also to be a visual awareness of the word key, because the left hand picks up a key. So there are these two visual awarenesses, but there's no visual awareness of both together. If there was visual awareness of both together, the person would say, when asked what you see, they would say key ring, and when asked to pick up the thing that corresponds to what they see, they would pick up a key ring. So there's a visual awareness evidently of ring and of key, but they're not experienced together. So question, is this one awareness or one visual field or two? It seems like there's two different visual fields happening in play here. Does that mean that there's one subject or two subjects? Is there one person with two visual fields or two subjects with their own visual fields? This is the kind of issue we have now got to discuss. Here's another, on the next slide is another picture of a very similar experiment, which is nicely described because it shows you the routes that the information goes. So you can see what they do here is, just look at those two pictures on the right, they write the word face on the left or the right hand side of the screen. And again, the person is asked to fixate straight ahead. So when they write it on start with the furthest to the right picture, when they write it on the left-hand side, that info goes into the right hemisphere, and they're asked what they see. They say nothing, because the left hemisphere is looking at the blank right-hand screen, but the left hand will draw a picture of a face. And conversely, when you show face to the right visual hemisphere, the info goes to the left hemisphere, and the person will say, I see face, but they won't be able to draw, they won't draw anything because they don't see it. The right hemisphere isn't seeing anything. So that's just to explain the same phenomenon again. All right, so here's one more example. This is from Kathy Wilkes. The patient was asked to form a structure. This is not her experiment. She's a philosopher. Just to make this clear, the patient was asked to form a structure from a number of building blocks using the right hand only. This was done in full view. The right hand was clumsy and slow, and the left hand moved in to help, brushing aside the right hand. This is one person, or one body at least they're talking about. The experimenter pushed away the left hand. A few moments later, the left hand again attempted to take over. This time the patient, with his right hand, grabbed the left wrist and pushed it away. Imagine. This is not sci-fi, this is real life. But you cannot keep a good hand down, and in the end the patient had to sit on the intrusive left hand to prevent it from interfering further. Okay, crazy. So, does this threaten phenomenal unity? So the next slide says phenomenal disunity. Why might you think it threatens phenomenal unity? Well, as I mentioned, many consider the unity of consciousness to be an a priori or necessary truth about minds. Well, I didn't say that but I said people tend to think where you've got, it's intuitive that where you've got the unity of consciousness, you've got one mind or one subject. And where you've got one mind and one subject, you've got one unified consciousness. In other words, the things this subject experiences at a time are experienced together, phenomenally speaking. Split brain syndrome seems to threaten this. So here's an argument adapted from Tim Bain, which you can call the disunity argument. So thinking about the person in the keyring experiment. So it seems that S has experiences with the content's key and with the content key and with the content ring. Somewhere there's a visual. Somewhere in that head, there's a visual experience of ring because they say ring, and there's a visual experience of key because they grab a key based on what they see. But S has premise 2. S has no experience with the content key ring or key and ring, because if S did, then S would say I see key ring, and they would pick up the key ring. So they have two experiences. Those are not experienced together. So the conclusion seems to follow. S's experience with contents key and ring are phenomenally disunified. Somehow there are two experiences in that head that are not experienced together. And you see, Bain assumes that that's one subject. So that's one subject, one person having two visual experiences that are not unified with one another, as they experience them somehow completely separately. It's very hard to imagine what that means, but obviously we're going to come on to discuss some interpretations of what's going on now. But I just try to, I'll save my example for the next slide actually. So what's going on in split brain cases? This is the next slide. So our main question is this: does the split brain syndrome threaten phenomenal unity, the unity of consciousness? Does it threaten it? Does it really threaten it? That depends in part, the answer to that question, on whether we agree that there's one subject in play. As Bain seems to say, there's one subject, one person, one mind. If you've got one mind, then you can say there's one mind, but it's got disunified experiences. Or if you wanted to stick to the unity of consciousness quite strongly, you could say, well, no, if there are fragmented experiences in that way, then those must correspond each to a different subject. So you've actually got multiple subjects in one head. So that's kind of like the choice point, if you like, roughly speaking. So some options. So these are the interpretations I'll look at. You've got one mind with disunified consciousness, two separate minds that are each unified in themselves, 3, no fact to the matter about how many minds are there, 4, one unified mind which switches, it sort of hops from one hemisphere to the other. Weird view, that's Bain's view actually. Or 5, 2 overlapping minds. All right, here we go. This might be a good point to ask Finn some questions if you haven't got the experiment or unity of consciousness clear, because you'll need to have those pretty clear in the bit to come. All right, option 1. one mind with disunified consciousness. So here's Tim Bain. The split brainer, it seems, has simultaneous but phenomenally disunified experiences, but still one subject having these experiences. S. I mean, why say there's one subject? Well, there's one person, one body there, one brain, even if it's split in two. In normal life, the person behaves pretty normally, and you would treat them as one person. It's not that their relatives now think there are two people there. So there's, good evidence on the face of it that there's still one subject there, but they seem to have disunified experiences. So Kathy Wilkes gives this analogy. Someone driving while holding a conversation. So think about that, or as you drive, or some other activity that you've got your mind focused on, but you're also talking to someone else at the same time. In that sort of situation, the driver may then be unable to say what they've been doing on the driving side. So their mind is on the conversation. With me, it probably happens the other way around as well. I'm focusing on the driving, and I'm sort of blabbing to whoever is in the passenger seat, but not really paying attention to what they say, and I may not be able to say afterwards what I've been talking about. So you could have it either way around. But Kathy Wilkes is evidently being polite by focusing on, although somewhat dangerous, by focusing on the conversation. So it's similar. So you might think this is similar to a split brainer's inability to say what they see in the left visual field. So you're focusing on the driving, and that's one conscious experience. You are also consciously experiencing the conversation, though your attention is on the driving side. But you're having two experiences, but you're not having them together. They're separated from one another phenomenally, and that shows up, I suppose, in the fact that you'd be unable to say what you were doing on the. So you're focusing on the conversation. Everything. That shows up in the fact that you're unable then to say what you were doing on the driving side. To try to imagine what this might be like, the way I think of it is, when you're looking at a scene, but then you start daydreaming. I really think often about where does daydreaming happen, because if I have a very vivid visual daydream, like for some reason right now I'm visualizing probably because it's an analogy, but I'm visualizing anyway, you're having a daydream, and having a visual vivid daydream is a bit like there being another screen, TV screen in your mind somewhere, and you when it stops, you suddenly hit with the visual scene in front of you again, and it strikes you as, in some sense, not having been there for a while. It can be like it really hits you, and so it seems like you've. So what I was visualizing then was a security guard looking at a bank of TV monitors, because it seems it's a bit like that. Because clearly your eyes are open, the visual information is coming in, you are seeing colours, and unless you think you're somehow completely unconscious of the visual scene, if you hold a sparse theory, we could go back to that issue. But you might think you are conscious of if you're a Ridge theorist, you are conscious of the visual scene, but you're also conscious of this daydream, and they're happening on two different screens, and in some sense they're not phenomenally unified, because you are having each of them but not together. They're happening in completely different places, so to speak, in your mind. So that might be a way of understanding what Wilkes is getting at, or this idea of one mind with two disunified experiences. Okay, now objections. One main objection by Lockwood in his 1989 book. He says that, look, this driver is either unconscious of the driving and they're conscious of the conversation, or their consciousness is perhaps switching back and forth between driving and talking. It's sort of, now it's on the driving, now it's on the talking, but never on both at once. So there's not any time at which you've got simultaneous disunified experiences. You've either got a unified experience of driving or of talking, one after the other, or you're unconscious of the driving, but you're focusing on the talking. But there's no time at which you've got two experiences that is unified. So that would preserve the unity of consciousness. But if you understand the thing I said about daydreaming, and you agree with Wilkes, and you think that the driver is conscious of driving and talking, then this looks quite a neat interpretation. So it's your job during the interpretations to position yourself, which one grabs you most, and then that's one of the things obviously you'll discuss in the seminar, and evidently the kind of thing that an exam question pick on. So option 2, two separate minds. This is, the most striking and obvious, but in a way attractive. You want to say, oh my God, two minds in one head. Wow, one mind per hemisphere. So on this view, there are two separate streams of consciousness, one per hemisphere. They're divided from one another. Each one is phenomenally unified within itself, so each one is having its own bubble of experiences, but those bubbles are separate. So it's two people in one head in a way. Phenomenal unity marks a subject or a mind, so we have two minds in one head, one per hemisphere. Here's Sperry from an experiment 1986. It says, each hemisphere seems to have its own perceptions, concepts, impulses, memories, inaccessible to the recall processes of the other. So the memory streams seem to be different. One hemisphere can't remember the stuff the other hemisphere did or experienced. That's quite a strong marker, suggester of there being two different subjects. I mean, that's part of Locke's theory of personal identity is all based on what you can remember. So by that criterion, these are two different people, two different minds entirely. Notice that most people who posit two streams of consciousness claim that you've got one subject with two streams. That was the option we just looked at. There's one person with two disunified experiences or streams of consciousness. This is the option that there are two separate and unified in themselves streams of consciousness, two separate subjects, if you like. So one subject with disunified experiences, here's two subjects with each with its own unified experiences. First objection to this one. How do split brainers get on so normally in everyday life? Because they do. I mean, weird stuff happens, like the person with the blocks, and also there's one where a case where someone is pulling on a dress or clothing with one arm and taking it off with the other, and then there starts to be a sort of fight. But generally speaking, this is only something that shows up in experimental conditions. If you've got two subjects in one head, you might expect there to be more. You might expect that to show up more problematically in everyday behaviour. I mean, just to see that, just imagine that two of you got hitched, tied together by rope, and then had to go around for 24 hours. It's just obvious that you'd sometimes want to go in different directions. You sometimes want to do different stuff. There'd be fights. It would show up in your behaviour. You wouldn't be able to get away with. If we put a big suit on you, pretending you were one person, you wouldn't be able to get away with being one person. It would show up in your behaviour. So why doesn't it show up in the split brainers' behaviour if they really are two different minds in that head? That's Nagel's question. He started the philosophical focus on the split brain syndrome with his paper Split Brains and what's it called? Oh, I can't remember. Anyway, it's at the bottom of the lecture slides. Suddenly can't remember what it's called. Okay, so possible reply to Nagel's question. Perhaps the split brain is only split in experimental conditions. Somehow putting them in front of that key ring board and probing them with psychological questions makes the split happen, and that would explain why in normal life there's no evidence of the split. Obviously, this is a pretty bad reply because it's ad hoc and unexplained. Why would they split in? What's special about the experimental conditions? That's what we would want to know. I mean, maybe there's something to be said there. Perhaps in normal life, they're never forced to fixate on one thing in such a way that the gap between the visual information each hemisphere shows up. Perhaps they're always scanning around in such a way that both hemispheres get the information of whatever they're looking at. And there are all kinds of other communication channels. I mean, if someone's writing down key, normally they could turn and look, and the left hemisphere would then know that and be able to say, "Oh, I'm seeing key as well." Even though the corpus callosum is cut, there'd be like workaround communication channels that they could make use of to get at what the other hemisphere is experiencing or perceiving. But in the experimental conditions, it's quite carefully isolated, so that can't happen. So maybe there's some mileage in that reply, but maybe there's a better reply. So next slide. Reply 2. So you might think the two streams have exactly the same content, so there'd be no phenomenal inconsistency to affect behavior, and that's called duplication. So the idea here is you've got two separate streams and two separate subjects, but they're both having exactly the same. They have exactly the same content. There's exactly the same stuff going on in both hemispheres, so they agree on everything, and there'd be no manifestation of behavior. Just like if you happen to agree on everything, like perhaps if you bound two twins together at the hip and they happen to agree on everything somehow, like think of the Hogan sisters right here actually, perhaps there would be no evidence in normal behaviour of the splitting. But objection 1 to this reply: having identical total content in each hemisphere is impossible because the hemispheres are different. Each one has got different cognitive, emotional, intentional, and agentive content. This is the kind of thing when people say, look, one hemisphere is more creative or emotional, and the other one's more rational or logical. I mean, that's crude, but there seem to be some differences in the style of cognition of the hemispheres, put it that way. And so, yes, it's not plausible that they could be identical content-wise. Another reply is, even if they had identical content somehow, that would still trigger different behaviours because the hemispheres have got different cognitive styles, different ways of handling even the same information. So there would still be conflict between them, and that would show up in everyday behaviour. So this is not a good reply to the objection. Also, against this completely separate minds interpretation, there's quite a lot of evidence that there are not two completely separate streams, but there's partial unity. There's some sharing of information, but not all. Particularly, the thought here is that the old animal brain areas are still shared between the hemispheres, even when you cut the corpus callosum. So there's a picture here of the new brain and the old brain. The new brain is the cortex, the bit above the dotted line. The corpus callosum is the connection between the two hemispheres of cortex. The cortex is the new brain that does the thinking, reasoning. It's where consciousness happens. We think it's obviously the visual cortex is in the cortex. Clue is in the name. There are older brain areas that we share with all our mammalian ancestors. Having such a big cortex is quite distinctively human, and also monkeys have that. But the old brain areas we share with them. But anyway, the point here is the old brain is associated with cruder things like, as it says here, fear, control, dominance, and the reflexes. Sort of instincty stuff, if you like, less rational, less on the surface of cognition and thought, more instinctive. So even if when you cut the corpus callosum, you sever the hemispheres at that level, the cortex hemispheres. It may not be right to say you've got two completely separate streams of consciousness or subjects, because they still share the lower animal areas. That has not been cut. So there's like a division to a certain point, but there's a shared bit underneath. And so perhaps you don't want to say there are two completely separate minds. These findings, says Bain, suggest that the availability of content to systems of cognitive consumption in the split brain is a messy and somewhat fragmented affair, rather than one in which there's a clean division between two clearly demarcated workspaces. He's just said what I just said, but in more complicated words. The split doesn't seem to be total, it seems to be partial for various reasons. So maybe we don't want to go with that option. Here's a funny cartoon for you to look at. I like this one. Okay. Have a break for a minute. Okay, break over. Next slide. Option 3. No fact of the matter. There's just no answer to the question, how many minds or subjects or streams of consciousness do split brainers have? There's just no answer to that question. So the unity of consciousness is not an all or nothing affair. It's not that there's a precise number of subjects in there or a precise number of unified conscious bubbles. Or that you can say a mind is certainly unified or certainly disunified. It's just not that clear cut either way. That's the thought. So Nagel, in his 1971 paper, says you've got one person because you've got one body, but there's no specific number of minds attached to them. And you might think, you can talk about this in the seminar, that if that's the case for split brainers, perhaps that's really the truth about us. All that's happened in the split brain case is you've kind of unhooked the horse from the carriage, but they were always separate things. They just happened to be hitched together. So all the split brain case has done is reveal the fact that there's not a fact. There's not really a fact. You can't really count minds. You can't really say there's one mind, one head, and one unity of consciousness. The reality is much more messy than that. And perhaps that's true for us. It's just disguised in normal circumstances by the corpus callosum being intact. So be careful. This is not the claim that there are no minds in there. And this is not the claim that there's a certain number of minds, we just can't find out how many. This is the claim that when it comes to minds, there's no fact of the matter about how many there are. It's just not a question you can ask. Maybe clouds are like that, right? It's all very well when clouds are spread out across the sky separately, but when they're all in a mush, so how many clouds are there? It might not be a sensible question. It might be arbitrary how you carve it up. So perhaps the same is true of minds, and that's what split brain syndrome shows us. We're wrong to think of minds as unified, single bubble things. Okay, uncomfortable but interesting option. So Lockwood has an objection to this. It's got some persuasiveness to it, but we'll see what you think. There must be, he says, there must be at least one what it's like to be associated with the brain of each such subject. So each split brainer, there must be at least one what it's like to be. There must be at least, so you say, what you talk about Nagel's sense of what it's like to be someone. There's something it's like to be you, there's nothing it's like to be a rock, as picking out consciousness, right? We've talked quite a lot, many times, about what's it like to be you at one moment, what are you experiencing? So he's saying there is obviously some of that going on in there. There's a what it's like. There's at least one what it's like in there, because this is a person that's having experiences. So there's some what it's like and it's going on in that head. Okay. So he says, if so, there must surely be something that would count as imagining what it is like to be such a subject. So we try to imagine what it's like to be a split brainer. Obviously, we probably get it wrong. But there's something that would count as getting it right. Maybe we can't do it, but there's some way it's like for them. So there must be something it would count as imagining what it would be like to be such a subject. There will be an answer to the question of how many distinct such imaginings are called for in order to capture the inside story. So, you imagine they're seeing ring, and you imagine they're seeing key. He's saying, how many imaginings do you have to do to capture what it's like for them from the inside? There is an answer to that question. And so there's a number you can attach to how many imaginings and how many unified bubbles of experience the subject is having. So there's an answer to the question, how many streams of consciousness are in there, he says. So he thinks that Nagel's view is ultimately incoherent. See what you think about that. Anything else to say about this no fact of the matter one? Nope. Option 4, one unified mind which switches, and this is Tim Bain's preferred option in his Journal of Philosophy paper that I've given you to read. So he says, the switch model holds that consciousness in the split brain switches between the patient's two hemispheres. So it sort of jumps somehow. Consciousness is in one, it's one consciousness, but it's in one hemisphere now, and the next moment in the next hemisphere. The hemispheres contribute in succession to the contents of the patient's consciousness. So that makes it sound like the consciousness is a thing, and each hemisphere contributes to it one after the other. That sounds a bit dualist, as if it's separate from the hemispheres. If you were a physicalist, you'd obviously have to think it was more involved in the hemispheres themselves, rooted in them, so that it's sort of somehow hopping between them. So the hemispheres contribute in succession to the contents of the patient's consciousness, but for the most part at least, consciousness does not occur in both hemispheres simultaneously. So what's going on in the keyring experiment? So the split brain is one consciousness provided by each hemisphere in turn. So in the keyring experiment, the subject sees both key and ring. It's just that they don't see them at the same time. So they've one unified experience of ring, which is when they say, "I see ring," and the switching must be very, very quick. Then they have a split second later, they have another visual experience, where consciousness switches to the right hemisphere. They have a visual experience of what the right hemisphere sees, namely the word key, and then the left hand grabs the key. Then quickly back to the left hemisphere again, right, left, right, like that. So they're experiencing, it's like the visual field would be alternating very, very fast. They would see what's on the left and what's on the right very, very quickly. It would be kind of fluctuating. So there'd be no disunified experience, because unity is at a time. But at a time, there would only be one of the hemispheres lit up, as it were. So there's no threat to disunity, to unity here. Apparently there's evidence of fluctuating perception in split brainers in this paper cited by Bain, so that might support his view. Objection. He calls this one mind switching or one consciousness switching hemispheres. But why? What reason is there to call it that? Why not say that it's two minds blinking on and off in turn? So there's a mind in the right hemisphere that's on, while the left hemisphere mind is off. It's on, off, on, off, on, off. When the left hemisphere mind is conscious, the right hemisphere mind is not, and vice versa. Of course, you'd have to have some explanation of what was causing this to happen, which to me is just cutting the corpus callosum, doesn't seem to explain it, but I don't know. But anyway, he calls that one consciousness switching hemispheres. Why not call it two minds blinking on and off in turn, in which case it more resembles the two separate streams of consciousness, two separate minds position, just that they're not on at the same time. But then if you're going to go for two separate minds, why not just say they're on all the time? I guess brain scans would help with this. We could see whether if we knew what the correlate of consciousness was, what the marker in the brain of consciousness was, we could see whether the consciousness of each hemisphere was alternating that way. Also, the way he puts it, as I say, there's something dualist about it. If it sounds like there's a consciousness and it's being fed by each hemisphere in turn, but that sort of makes the consciousness sound like it's something apart from the brain. So you might, if you think dualism is a problem, you might think that that's a problem. But I know that some of you will think this is a pretty cool model, actually. So fine, it's something you can discuss. I'm now sad that I'm going to miss the discussion. One more interpretation. Two overlapping minds. I can't disguise the fact that this is my favourite one. But anyway, you'll see why. So the thought here is each hemisphere has its own mind, or its own subject associated with it. Perhaps most of their experiences are private to one mind or the other. So most of their experiences are disunified with the other subject. They have, to some extent, a private bubble of their own, but it's not complete. So this goes back to the stuff about the old animal brain connection that still exists. Certain experiences are actually shared. They're like something for both hemispheres. So this ought to make you think a bit of the Hogan twins from the telepathy lecture. So there's a connection. So most of their visual experiences, let's say, are disunified. There are two separate bubbles of visual experiences for these two minds. but there's some overlap of other kinds of experiences. So here's an experiment that seems to suggest this interpretation. Split brainers are shown a naked picture of the opposite sex, or whichever sex would arouse a reaction in them. Shown a naked picture of the opposite sex in the left visual hemisphere. So why the left? Think about that. Obviously, the left visual. Sorry, is that right? They're showing it in the left. Yeah, they're showing it in the left visual hemisphere. So which brain hemisphere is getting the info? The right, and we know the right can't speak. So this is visual information that can't be reported. Okay, now, because they've had their corpus callosum cut. Typically, the subject blushes as is embarrassed, but is unable to say why. They're unable to say why because the info has gone to the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere is not seeing the picture, and it's the one that can talk. Nevertheless, it's clear that the whole subject experiences some emotional reaction. One male subject remarked, so this is the left hemisphere talking, "Wow, that's some machine you've got there." So it seems like this person felt embarrassed, or sort of was aware that, the left hemisphere seemed to be aware of the feeling of embarrassment or whatever, and then tried to make something up to as to why they were feeling that. So they couldn't see the picture of the naked person, so they say, "Wow, that's some machine you've got there," or something. They say something sort of silly. They make something up. So that suggests that though they can't see the picture, they are having the feeling that it causes, which the right hemisphere has. So they share a feeling. In the experiment, here's what Lockwood thinks. In the experiment, both hemispheres have access to the embarrassment and or sexual arousal, while only the inarticulate, unable to speak, right hemisphere has access to the reason behind it. So perhaps if you got the left hand to write down why they're embarrassed, it would be able to say, "I'm looking at a picture of a naked person." So it looks like the visual contents are not unified. There are two separate visual experiences there. One is of this naked picture for the right hemisphere, and for the left hemisphere, it's of nothing. And that causes a feeling of arousal, which is in the old animal brain, and then the left hemisphere has some access to that. So that's why we will say something to make up, to try to explain why they're having that feeling, because they don't really know what's causing it. It's like an unexplained feeling to them. So that looks like they're two separate to some extent, but they overlap. These two minds overlap. So, can a quale state, like a feeling of embarrassment, be experienced by two different minds at a time? That will take you back to the Hogan twins and telepathy from last lecture, so you can tell Finn about that and discuss that in the seminar. Okay. Oh, I don't have any objections to the overlap view. I guess that's because I like it too much. But there must be some objections. I'm sure you can come up with some. I guess it's weird. Perhaps it's not completely coherent. Because what does it mean to say that they're two minds but they're overlapping? I guess perhaps this will go back to whether you think telepathy is coherent. So you might want to discuss that with Finn in the seminar and tell him about the Hogan twins. All right, final slide. What does all this mean for the unity of consciousness? All it takes, says Bain, all it takes for a subject to have a unified consciousness at a time is the existence of a single phenomenal state or phenomenal field, a big experience, the overall global, what we call the total phenomenal state, that subsumes each of the subject's experiences at that time. Subsumes, contains, takes in. So all it takes is one big experience that has as components or envelops all these other mini experiences, like what you're seeing, tasting, smelling, and so on. Do any of the interpretations of split brains threaten the unity of consciousness? Let's look through them. Switching. No. You've got one unified mind there with alternating contents, but at each moment it's unified, it's just that it's switching hemispheres. Or you've got, on the other interpretation of it, two unified minds going on and off, blinking on and off. But still, when each is on, it's phenomenally unified, it's having its own bubble, so there's no threat to the unity of consciousness there. What about two separate minds? Again, no. That's the idea that each hemisphere is its own mind, having its own experiences. But for one hemisphere, it's having a phenomenally unified set of experiences, and the other one's having its own phenomenally unified set of experiences. So there's no disunity. This disunity there is not in the experiences. It's not in the unity of consciousness. It's in the fact that you've got two different subjects. they're two subjects, but each is still unified in itself. What about the no fact of the matter interpretation from Nagel? I'm not sure what to say about this, so have a think about it. But if there's no fact of the matter as to how many minds, can there be a fact of the matter about the unity of that mind? I don't know. Nagel seems to think there's no fact of the matter about the unity of consciousness there. So what's the answer? Is there unity of consciousness? The answer is there's no fact of the matter, perhaps whatever that means. But maybe that's enough to say there isn't unity of consciousness. I don't know. I'm not even sure I know what that means. What about two overlapping minds? This is slightly tricky because obviously they overlap. They're not two discrete bubbles of consciousness like in the two streams or two separate minds interpretation. But isn't there still unity of consciousness here? So there's two minds. So in the embarrassment case with the naked picture, there's a left hemisphere mind and a right hemisphere mind. The right hemisphere mind visually experiences the picture, knows why it's embarrassed, feels embarrassed and knows why. The left hemisphere doesn't see the picture and also feels the embarrassment and doesn't know why. So there's something they share, the feeling of embarrassment, but it still looks like they're phenomenally unified. There's a set of... It's not that they're private, which was when I explained it in terms of different people on the metro and stuff, on the underground. I pointed out that each person's bubble is separate, but that's not built into unity. Unity is the idea that these things are experienced together. It doesn't include the idea of excluding other people, actually. So here, even though there's an overlap in the experiences, you've still got each mind is still unified within itself, which is to say all of the things it experiences together. There's no disunity, even if for at least one thing it experiences, some other mind is also directly experiencing that. So this doesn't look to threaten the unity of consciousness either, though it might threaten the privacy of minds, but that would be something else. Good. What about the first interpretation looked at? One disunified mind, Kathy Wilkes's one with the driving and my one with the daydreaming. This looks like the one which, obviously it's in the name, disunified. This threatens unity. If one can genuinely have two experiences at the same time without experiencing them together, then unity fails. So, according to me, whether you think split brains threaten the unity of consciousness will depend on whether you go for the ones that look plausible that maybe no fact of the matter threatens it, and obviously one disunified mind threatens it if you think that's an acceptable interpretation. So you have to decide which one you go for. And that's it. And there you go. Nagel's paper is brain bisection and the unity of consciousness. Thanks. Now, that's it. That's the end.